What does it mean when the most envied address in America sits empty, its gates locked, its famous grotto filled with cement? The Gothic mansion at 10,236 Charing Cross Road in Los Angeles once promised paradise. Now it stands as testimony to a darker truth. Sometimes the cage is gilded, and the prisoners arrive willingly, not realizing they've walked into a trap disguised as freedom. The mansion is silent now. The zoo that once housed flamingos and peacocks stands empty. The game house where Hollywood royalty gathered sits locked and dark. Most telling of all, the famous grotto has been filled in completely, sealed like a tomb, contamination making it too dangerous to remain. This is what remains of adult Disneyland. For decades, the Playboy Mansion represented the ultimate American fantasy. The bunny logo on those gates promised entry into a world where desire met opportunity, where glamour masked nothing sinister, where the pursuit of happiness required no price beyond admission. But stand here long enough in the silence and a question emerges, unavoidable and terrible. What if the most famous symbol of freedom in American culture was actually its opposite? What if the mansion everyone wanted to enter was designed, from its very foundation, not as paradise but as a prison, its bars simply invisible to those who hadn't lived behind them? Former residents have begun to speak. Their testimony reveals carpets soaked with dog urine that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. Bedrooms frozen in 1970s decay, never renovated despite the mansion's wealth. Strict curfews enforced by security. Financial dependency maintained through controlled allowances. Psychological manipulation disguised as relationship dynamics. The adult Disneyland, they say, was rotting from within, its infrastructure crumbling while cameras captured only carefully staged glamour. How does a place become both the most desired destination in America and a prison its inmates didn't realize they were trapped inside until they escaped? How does a brand selling liberation build a fortress of control? The answer lies in the distance between what was photographed and what was lived, between the brand and the reality, between the promise of the bunny logo and the truth of the mansion's locked gates. The Playboy empire sold the world a fantasy so complete, so seductive, that millions believed it. But belief doesn't change what happened inside those walls. This is the story of Hugh Hefner's Playboy Mansion, not the version sold in magazines or shown on television. The real story, told by those who lived it, confirmed by what remains now that the fantasy has finally collapsed. It begins, as all tragedies do, with a dream that seemed beautiful until you looked too closely and saw the rot beneath. Every empire begins with a wound. The man who would build the most famous pleasure palace in America was born in a home where pleasure was suspect, where affection was withheld. Hugh Marston Hefner arrived in Chicago on April 9, 1926, the first son of Grace and Glenn Hefner, both teachers, both devout Methodists. He would later describe his childhood with precision. No drinking, no swearing, no display of affection or emotion of any kind. His mother wanted him to become a missionary. Instead, he became the high priest of a very different religion. The boy was shy, awkward, trapped. So he reinvented himself. In high school, he started calling himself Hef, founded a school newspaper, drew cartoons where he controlled the narrative. After serving in the army during World War II, he studied psychology at the University of Illinois. The quiet boy was learning to understand desire, to recognize that America was starving for something it couldn't name. By 1953, Hefner worked as a copywriter at Esquire magazine in Chicago. He asked for a $5 raise. They denied him. That rejection became his declaration of independence. He would create his own magazine, his own world, his own rules. He raised just over $8,000 from 45 investors, including $1,000 from his mother and brother combined. In December of 1953, working from his kitchen in Hyde Park, Hefner produced the first issue of Playboy. The magazine wasn't dated because he wasn't sure there would be a second. The cover featured Marilyn Monroe. Inside, a nude photograph she had posed for years earlier became the first centerfold. Hefner paid $500 for the rights. Monroe herself received nothing. Sold for 50 cents, approximately 54,000 copies disappeared from newsstands in weeks. The magazine was an instant sensation, not just because of Monroe's nudity, but because of what Hefner promised alongside it. This wasn't pornography hidden in brown paper. This was sophistication. The first issue included fiction by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, articles on jazz and football. Hefner was selling a vision. The modern man could appreciate both intellectual pursuits and beautiful women. The brand was born. The iconic bunny logo appeared in the second issue, a rabbit in a bow tie. It would become one of the most recognizable symbols in the world. The logo promised entry into a club, membership in a lifestyle, access to a world most men could only dream about. But here's what matters. Hefner wasn't just creating a magazine. He was constructing an entire philosophy that positioned him as liberator while establishing the framework for total control. The Playboy philosophy argued that American Puritanism had oppressed natural desires, that men deserved pleasure without guilt. It was compelling. It was revolutionary. It was also a justification for building a kingdom where one man's desires determined everyone else's reality. The magazine made Hefner wealthy. By the early 1960s, Playboy was selling nearly a million copies monthly. But wealth wasn't enough. Fantasy required physical form. The brand needed a home where the lifestyle promised in photographs could become tangible. Hefner would build that home in Los Angeles, in a Gothic Tudor mansion in Holmby Hills, the most famous address in American fantasy, and the most invisible prison. In 1971, Hefner paid $1,050,000 for a piece of Gothic Tudor architecture that would become the physical manifestation of his brand. The price was a record for Los Angeles County. The mansion sat on 5.5 acres in Holmby Hills, part of the Platinum Triangle. 29 rooms, nearly 22,000 square feet. Built in 1927 for the son of a department store magnate. The property was everything Hefner wanted. Remote enough for privacy, prestigious enough for status, large enough to contain an entire universe. The previous owners had maintained it as a respectable residence. Hefner would transform it into something unprecedented, a permanent stage set for the Playboy lifestyle, a place where fantasy could be photographed, filmed, experienced, proven real. Within months, construction crews swarmed the property. Hefner hired Ron and Suzanne Dursmith, the architectural team from his Chicago projects. Their directive: create outdoor entertainment amenities that would eclipse every other property in Los Angeles. Hefner gave them creative freedom. He wanted a pool, a grotto, animal habitats, a redwood forest, tennis courts, paradise visible over every neighbor's wall. The centerpiece would be the swimming pool and grotto, completed in early September after a 4-month deadline. This wasn't an ordinary pool. The designers created the template for lagoon pool aesthetics that dominated 1970s luxury. Stone outcroppings, natural formations, waterfalls you could walk behind or swim through. The grotto itself was revolutionary. An underground cave, system connecting the main pool to heated spa areas with unprecedented water massage capabilities. The zoo came next. One of the only private residential properties in Los Angeles with an actual zoo license. Spider monkeys in elaborate cages, peacocks roaming freely, flamingos, macaws, exotic birds. The animals weren't decoration. They were props in ongoing theater, living symbols of the exotic and untamed. A game house sat separate from the main mansion, with pool tables, pinball machines, private rooms with mirrored walls and plush carpeting. Tennis courts, outdoor kitchens and stone bars, redwood forests and fern grottos creating the illusion of discovered nature rather than purchased landscaping. Every detail calculated to photograph beautifully, to suggest freedom while representing total control. Hefner occupied the upper floors. His private quarters would eventually span more than 7,000 square feet, designed in carved oak echoing 1970s aesthetics. These spaces would remain largely unchanged for decades, frozen in the moment of their creation, never renovated. The mansion opened to parties. They began smaller, intimate, but word spread like legend. By the mid-1970s, invitations to the Playboy Mansion were among the most coveted in America. The parties weren't just celebrations, they were proof that the lifestyle Hefner sold in magazines actually existed. Celebrities arrived. Actors, musicians, politicians, business titans. Everyone wanted inside the gates. What no one saw in photographs was that the mansion had one entrance, one set of gates. Security controlled all access. To enter paradise, you needed permission. Once inside, you followed paths Hefner designed, saw what he wanted photographed, experienced what he constructed. The Gothic Tudor architecture that suggested respectability now served a different purpose. The adult Disneyland was complete. The world saw freedom. Hefner had built a fortress. Both things could be true at once, because very few people understood yet that paradise, when designed by a single person for a single purpose, stops being paradise and becomes something else. A stage set, a controlled environment, a kingdom where one man determined every rule. The mansion would stand for decades as proof that the Playboy dream was real. Only later would anyone realize they should have asked a different question, not whether the dream was real, but who the dream was actually for. Picture paradise on a summer night in 1976. Through the gates of 10,236 Charing Cross Road, limousines arrive in procession. Women in silk and satin, men in tuxedos. Security checks the invitation list. Only those chosen may enter. This is the golden age, when the Playboy Mansion was proof that American dreams could materialize. The Midsummer Night's Dream Party became the crown jewel of the mansion's calendar, an annual celebration that defined exclusivity. The dress code was brilliantly subversive. Pajamas, lingerie, sleepwear. Guests arrived in $1,000 negligees, custom silk robes, designer loungewear. The requirement stripped away formality while maintaining expense, creating the illusion of casual intimacy at an event with hundreds of strangers. The mansion grounds transformed for these parties. Acrobats performed over the swimming pool. Models painted gold and silver posed as living statues. The grotto became the evening's focal point, steam rising from heated water, waterfalls creating white noise that gave the illusion of privacy in crowds. Champagne flowed from bars stationed every 50 feet. The guest lists read like directories of American power. Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty became regulars. Musicians from Mick Jagger to later stars like Leonardo DiCaprio. Politicians whose names appeared in newspapers. Business executives whose decisions moved markets. Everyone who mattered sought invitations to Hefner's parties. The annual Halloween bash rivaled Midsummer Night's Dream in spectacle. The mansion decorated like a Gothic fever dream. Hired performers wandering the grounds like beautiful ghosts. These parties appeared in magazines, on television, in films that used the mansion as location. Each photograph reinforced the mythology. What the cameras captured was real. The parties happened, the celebrities attended, the champagne flowed exactly as advertised. But what the cameras captured was also theater, carefully staged performances. The parties weren't spontaneous celebrations, they were brand reinforcement, physical proof that Playboy delivered on its promises. Hefner understood something profound about American desire. People don't just want luxury. They want proof that luxury exists, evidence that paradise is real somewhere, even if they can never enter it themselves. The parties satisfied that hunger. Millions who would never receive invitations could see photographs in magazines, could watch television specials, could believe that somewhere behind Gothic gates, the dream was happening. The mansion became embedded in popular culture. Films used it as location. Television shows referenced it. A video game in 2005 let players simulate building Hefner's empire. The mansion transcended being a residence. It became a symbol, an idea, a promise. What no one questioned was simple. Who were these parties actually for? The guests arrived, drank champagne, mingled with celebrities, left with stories. But whose fantasy was being fulfilled? The parties served Hefner's brand, reinforced his magazine's mythology, provided content for his media empire. The guests were props in his ongoing production. Beneath the champagne and carefully photographed glamour, the mansion operated according to rules most guests never saw. One entrance controlled by security, permission required for access. Hefner's desires determining who entered, what happened, what got photographed. The parties looked like freedom. They were demonstrations of control so complete that nobody recognized it as control. The golden age would last for decades. Through the 70s, 80s, 90s, into the new millennium, the parties continued. But the fundamental dynamic never shifted. Paradise with a gatekeeper. Freedom that required permission. A dream that existed only for those who followed rules they didn't know they were following. The mansion sold liberation. What it delivered was a stage set where one man controlled every entrance, every performance, every frame. The guests believed they were participating in freedom. They were auditioning for roles in someone else's fantasy, paying for the privilege with their presence, their celebrity, their tacit endorsement of a brand that promised everything while delivering something far more complicated. The world saw these parties and believed the dream was real. They were right. The parties were exactly as spectacular as advertised. What they didn't understand was that spectacular doesn't mean free. Sometimes the most beautiful cage is the one that looks like paradise, where the prisoners arrive in limousines and leave with stories about the best night of their lives. They arrived dreaming of opportunity. Young women, most in their early 20s, selected for specific physical attributes: blonde hair, thin frames, particular facial features. They came from law school and modeling agencies, from nightclubs where older men bought them drinks and whispered about possibilities. They believed they were entering paradise. The reality awaiting them behind those Gothic gates was more complicated than any dream. The selection process itself was theater. Hefner would spot them at clubs, at parties, through mutual friends. Sometimes other girlfriends would recruit them, invited to become props in the ongoing production. The invitation seemed like the ultimate validation. Hugh Hefner wants you, specifically. The offer came with tangible benefits: a bedroom in the mansion, a weekly allowance of $1,000 in cash, access to parties where celebrities gathered, the promise of appearing in Playboy magazine, of launching a career, of connections that could change everything. What they discovered after moving in was a life governed by rules so pervasive that freedom became a distant memory. The 9 p.m. curfew was absolute. Every night, without exception, unless you were accompanying Hefner to an event. Staff members kept a logbook recording when each girlfriend left the mansion and when she returned. Hefner read this logbook every morning over breakfast, noting who had been where, tracking movements like a warden monitoring inmates. If you missed curfew, you lost your allowance for the week. If you left town and missed one of Hefner's scheduled club nights, he would withhold your money, wielding the $1,000 like a weapon. The allowance itself became a weekly humiliation. Every Friday morning, The girlfriends had to go to Hefner's bedroom and ask for their money. He would count out the cash from a safe in his bookcase, crisp $100 bills, 10 of them if you had followed all the rules. But the transaction was never just financial. Hefner used these moments to deliver criticism, to express displeasure, to remind each woman that she lived in his world according to his terms. Former girlfriend Isabella St. James described the process in her memoir, "Bunny tails. They all hated it, standing there while Hefner brought up anything he wasn't happy about." Most complaints focused on two things: lack of harmony among the girlfriends or lack of participation in the bedroom activities Hefner euphemistically called parties. The bedrooms themselves told the real story. While magazines photographed the mansion's grand public spaces, the private quarters where girlfriends actually lived were frozen in decay. Mismatched furniture that looked purchased from charity shops. Mattresses old, worn, and stained. Bed linens past their best. St. James, who lived in the mansion while attending law school in the early 2000s, described the reality behind the fantasy. It was as if someone had gone to a charity shop and bought the basics for each room. This was accommodation for props, not people. The girlfriends' bedrooms hadn't been renovated since the 1970s. The stench was inescapable. Hefner kept multiple dogs, and their urine soaked into carpets throughout the mansion. No amount of cleaning could eliminate the smell. A bad smell lingered everywhere, St. James recalled. Girlfriends navigated around stained floor coverings, lived with the constant odor of animal waste. The famous grotto, that underground paradise featured in countless magazine spreads, was reportedly contaminated. The mansion was literally rotting from within, decay spreading through walls and floors, while the exterior maintained its carefully curated illusion. Holly Madison moved into the mansion in 2001 at age 21. She would become Hefner's main girlfriend, the #1 position that came with its own specific duties. She slept in Hefner's bedroom, while other girlfriends had their own rooms. Years later, after leaving, she would describe the experience using clinical terminology. Stockholm Syndrome. She believed she was in love. Looking back, she recognized she had been psychologically manipulated into dependency. The weekly schedule was rigid, designed around Hefner's preferences and routines. Sundays were fun in the sun days, pool parties and movie screenings in the mansion's theater. Mondays were manly nights when Hefner's male friends came over for dinner and cards. Tuesdays were family nights when his ex-wife and sons visited. Wednesdays and Fridays were club nights, the most dreaded events on the calendar. Club nights followed precise choreography. The girlfriends would dress identically or in coordinated outfits, appearance dictated by Hefner's preferences. No red lipstick allowed. Hefner associated red lipstick with older women, 1950s models, and he wanted his girlfriends to look younger. Hair had to be blonde, maintained at salon appointments Hefner funded. The group would go to predetermined nightclubs where Hefner would sit in VIP sections long enough for photographs, then leave. He kept his nightclub appearances brief, enough for photo opportunities. The purpose wasn't entertainment, it was marketing, public performance of the Playboy lifestyle for cameras. But the real purpose of club nights came after. In the limousine returning to the mansion, activities began that former girlfriends describe with words like mandatory and expected and disgusting. Madison would later say she hated it, that she made it very known she hated it, but felt obligated to participate. By the time the group arrived back, everyone would be drunk, and they would go to Hefner's bedroom for what he called parties. Group activities involving Hefner, his main girlfriend, and whoever else he had decided should participate. Hefner would take Viagra and cover himself in baby oil. Toys were laid out on shelves. The session would proceed according to patterns established over years, performances the women knew they were expected to deliver. Former girlfriends are careful with their language describing these nights. Hefner always told them they didn't have to participate, that sex wasn't a duty, that they were free to decline. But they knew, with the certainty that comes from living in controlled environments, that declining had consequences. Hefner would be upset. There would be tension. Their position might be threatened. So they participated, understanding that freedom existed only in theory. Bridget Marquardt moved into the mansion in October 2002 after visiting for over a year. Kendra Wilkinson arrived later, completing the trio that would become famous through The Girls Next Door. The show premiered on E! In 2005, presenting a sanitized version of mansion life. What viewers saw was carefully edited, approved by Hefner, designed to reinforce the brand mythology. The show became an instant hit, watched by millions who believed they were seeing authentic life inside the mansion. What viewers didn't see was the isolation. Madison would later describe the mansion as cult-like in how it separated girlfriends from outside connections. "You had a 9 o'clock curfew," she explained. "You were encouraged not to have friends over. You weren't really allowed to leave unless it was like a family holiday. The curfew ensured they couldn't develop independent social lives. Many had secret boyfriends." Bridget Marquardt was reportedly still married to another man when she moved in, though separated and working toward divorce. Hefner knew about it and supported her move to Los Angeles. The secrecy around other relationships became its own form of control, forcing women to hide parts of their lives. The financial dependency was carefully constructed. $1,000 a week sounds generous until you realize it kept women exactly comfortable enough to stay, but never wealthy enough to leave easily. They couldn't save money because they were expected to spend it on maintaining appearance. If they left town to visit family, they lost that week's allowance. If you were out of town for any reason and missed one of the official going-out nights, Hefner wouldn't want to give the allowance. St. James recalled, "He used it as a weapon," she said plainly. The allowance was leverage, a tool for maintaining control disguised as generosity. Additional money came for events. When the Grammys or other major occasions approached, Hefner would provide $2,000 for an outfit, hair, and makeup. Later, as his finances became strained, that amount dropped. Then for some girlfriends, nothing at all. The variation itself was manipulation, creating hierarchy and competition. Medical and cosmetic procedures were covered. Hefner reportedly spent $70,000 annually on breast implants. Dental work, including veneers, plastic surgery, all available if Hefner approved. Your body became his investment, modified according to his aesthetic preferences. Former girlfriends describe asking permission for changes, living in bodies that felt increasingly like costumes rather than their own flesh. The cars were leased, not purchased. His own bedroom cost him $25,000 monthly in rent to Playboy Enterprises, a tax arrangement. The women themselves were line items, assets, props in ongoing brand management. Their expenses served marketing purposes, creating content that sold magazines. Holly Madison would later describe Hefner making comments about her appearance, suggesting she should make her nose smaller. The psychological impact of living under constant aesthetic judgment accumulated over months and years. Former girlfriends describe depression, anxiety, feelings of worthlessness. Madison admitted she was often addicted to alcohol during the relationship, using it to cope with what was expected of her. The mansion had one entrance. Security controlled all access. To leave, you needed permission, or at least needed to ensure your departure was logged. The gates that looked like garden features were actually barriers. "Everyone thinks that infamous metal gate was meant to keep people out," Madison would later say, "but I grew to feel it was meant to lock me in." Holly Madison left in 2008 after 7 years. She would marry someone else, have children, build a life that belonged to her rather than to a brand. Years later, she would publish Down the Rabbit Hole, describing experiences that contradicted every image from The Girls Next Door. Other former girlfriends would follow, telling stories that accumulated into undeniable pattern. The mansion wasn't paradise. It was a carefully constructed trap where young women exchanged freedom for access to fame. where the most famous symbol of liberation in American culture delivered its opposite. The girlfriends arrived willingly. That was the genius of the system. They chose to move in, chose to accept the money, chose to stay even as they recognized what they had entered. Choice under constrained circumstances isn't the same as freedom. When your options are structured by someone else, when leaving means losing everything you've built, choice becomes complicated to the point of meaninglessness. The Playboy bunny logo promised liberation. The mansion delivered a prison where the inmates wore lingerie and smiled for cameras and told themselves they were living the dream, even as they counted days until escape. By the 2000s, Hugh Hefner rarely left his bedroom. The man who had built an empire selling freedom now spent his days in a space measuring approximately 7,000 square feet, decorated in carved oak, fashionable when Jimmy Carter was president. His most difficult daily decision, as he liked to tell visitors, was choosing which of his 200 pairs of silk pajamas to wear. A tailor made them from silk purchased by the Bolt from France. Black for business, purple for special occasions. The silk against his skin was sensual, he told reporters. Comfortable. One of the key moments in his life was discovering he could get away with wearing pajamas most of the time. What started as practical attire for working late became his uniform, his brand, his armor against a world he no longer needed to engage directly. Control panels surrounded his bed, separate buttons for bed, drapes, sheer curtains, mirrors, slats. Everything responded to his fingertips. The lighting, the ambiance, the environment itself bent to his preferences. His king-sized bed sat square in the center, covered with a white comforter. Everything radiated from this point: his desires, his rules, his version of reality. The bedroom was organized for never leaving. Piles of videotapes stacked along walls, vintage movies carefully organized. Casablanca was his favorite, a film about love and sacrifice, none of which characterized his actual life. He watched films constantly, ate bowls of Lipton chicken noodle soup for most meals, drank 30 Pepsis some days, leaving a trail of cans like cigarette butts. The staff cleaned after him. The girlfriends arranged themselves according to his schedule. He rarely ate with other household members. While they gathered in the dining room around a large wood table with a life-sized cardboard cutout of Hefner in black silk pajamas serving as permanent stand-in, he remained upstairs. William, the executive chef, Brenda, the pastry chef, Alan, the butler, stood ready. But Hefner preferred his soup, his routine, his isolation. The mansion operated like a cruise ship with him as captain, navigating from bed. This isolation was deliberate construction of an environment where nothing happened without his awareness or approval. His closet held not just 200 pairs of silk pajamas, but also 35 custom Armani suits with turn-ups. He could dress properly when required. He chose not to because the pajamas communicated something essential. This was his world, and anyone entering accepted his terms. The girlfriends came to his bedroom every Friday morning to receive allowances. They had to ask for it, stand there while he counted out bills from the safe in his bookcase, listen while he delivered criticism. The transaction was never just about money. It was about reminding them who controlled resources. Some weeks he praised them. Other weeks he withheld money for infractions real or imagined. The uncertainty itself was part of the control. His schedule structured everyone else's life. Monday nights were manly nights when his male friends came for dinner and cards. The girlfriends made themselves scarce. Tuesday was family night when his ex-wife Kimberly Conrad and sons visited. The boys would navigate the strange territory of their father's bedroom, his closet filled with silk in every color. Wednesday and Friday were club nights, dreaded by girlfriends but essential to his brand. Sunday was fun in the Sunday, but even outdoor activities orbited around his preferences. Pool parties happened when he wanted them. Movie screenings showed films he selected, often the same classics he had watched dozens of times. The girlfriends wore what he preferred: blonde hair maintained at salons he funded. They smiled when photographed, performed happiness for cameras, maintained the illusion that this was paradise rather than carefully managed production. The bedroom activities themselves followed patterns established over decades. After club nights, the group would return drunk, go to Hefner's bedroom for what he called parties. He would take Viagra, cover himself in baby oil. The main girlfriend knew to prepare certain things, lay out toys. The other girlfriends understood they were expected to participate unless they wanted to risk his displeasure. He always said it was voluntary, that sex wasn't a duty. But everyone living there knew that declining had consequences invisible to outsiders, but unmistakable to anyone dependent on his approval. Isabella St. James described the bedroom rituals in her memoir, Bunny Tales. The routines were predictable, mechanical, performances everyone had rehearsed countless times. There was a script, unwritten but understood. Holly Madison would later say she hated the activities, made it very known, but felt obligated to participate. The obligation wasn't explicit. It was atmospheric, built into dependency structure. When someone controls your housing, income, access to opportunity, and daily schedule, declining their preferences becomes theoretically possible, but practically impossible. The manipulation was psychological rather than physical. Hefner created an environment where leaving felt harder than staying, where the world outside seemed less attainable than continuing to perform assigned roles. The girlfriends described feeling trapped while simultaneously believing they had chosen their situation. They had walked through the gates willingly. They could leave any time, but leaving meant abandoning everything: the lifestyle, the connections, the promise. The psychological architecture was sophisticated enough that most women didn't recognize it as architecture until years after they had escaped. The isolation compounded control. Girlfriends were discouraged from maintaining outside friendships. The 9 p.m. curfew made independent social lives impossible. Many developed secret boyfriends, relationships they hid because everyone understood Hefner expected their romantic attention to focus on him. Holly Madison would later describe the mansion as cult-like in how it separated residents from outside connections. "You had a curfew," she explained. "You were encouraged not to have friends over. You weren't really allowed to leave unless it was a family holiday." Hefner positioned himself as generous. He covered medical procedures, cosmetic surgeries, dental work. He reportedly spent $70,000 annually on breast implants alone. The cars girlfriends drove were leased through accounts he controlled. All money flowed through him. Salon appointments, clothing allowances, access to parties and celebrities, all of it came from him. Generosity that creates dependency isn't generosity. It's infrastructure for control. When everything can be taken away by one person's decision, that person doesn't need to threaten. The threat is structural, understood without ever being stated. The bedroom contained the mansion in miniature, control panels at his fingertips, a schedule everyone else followed, resources from his safe, activities according to his preferences, and pajamas, communicating his fundamental position: the world meets me on my terms. I can wear sleepwear to conduct business, receive guests, run an empire, because power means never adapting to anyone else's expectations. The girlfriends adapted. They dyed their hair blonde because Hefner preferred blonde. They wore coordinated outfits chosen according to his aesthetic. They smiled for cameras at parties they didn't always want to attend. They participated in activities they described later with words like mandatory and disgusting. They asked for weekly allowances like children asking parents for pocket money. They logged departures and returns like inmates on supervised release. They lived according to schedules designed entirely around one man's routines. And they called it freedom because the alternative was admitting they were trapped. Hefner rarely needed to threaten anyone explicitly. The system did the threatening for him. Every girlfriend knew that others waited for their position. Holly Madison left, and Hefner immediately moved Crystal Harris into the main girlfriend role. Every girlfriend understood that displeasure meant potentially losing everything. Every girlfriend recognized that the mansion operated according to rules favoring one person. By the late 2000s, Hefner was in his 80s. His movements slowed. Sometimes he appeared downstairs in flannel sleeping pajamas rather than silk public pajamas. And staff would exchange worried glances, recognizing these tiny changes as bellwethers. His friend Robert Culp, one of the Manly Night regulars, had died. So had Mel Torme. One week they sat at the dining table. The next week they didn't. The empty spaces were filled quickly, like infantry. But even in decline, the fundamental dynamic never shifted. The bedroom remained the center. The control panels still responded to his fingertips. The girlfriends still came Friday mornings. The world still operated according to his preferences. He ate his chicken noodle soup. He watched his vintage films. He wore his silk pajamas. He conducted his empire from bed, maintaining the illusion that this was liberation rather than what it actually represented. Control so complete it looked like comfort. The mansion had one entrance. The bedroom had one resident who determined everything else. The Playboy philosophy that positioned Hefner as liberator delivered a kingdom where one man's desires structured everyone else's reality. The brand sold freedom. The bedroom revealed what freedom meant in Hefner's universe. His freedom at everyone else's expense, maintained through financial control, psychological manipulation, and a system so thoroughly constructed that most people living inside couldn't see the architecture until they finally left and looked back. The silk pajamas weren't just clothing. They were declaration. The bedroom wasn't just living quarters. It was command center, and the man who spent his final decades rarely leaving. Those rooms wasn't reclusive. He was demonstrating what he had always believed, that paradise could be controlled by one person, that freedom meant his freedom, and that everyone else existed to serve the fantasy. Archie the house dog regularly relieved himself on the hallway curtains outside the bedroom, adding the scent of urine to what St. James called the general scent of decay. The carpets hadn't been changed in decades. Everything was old and stale. But inside that bedroom, Hefner controlled the lighting, the drapes, the mirrors. He controlled who entered, what they did, when they left. He controlled the narrative, the mythology, the ongoing performance that convinced the world he lived in paradise. The mansion sold liberation. The bedroom delivered what liberation meant to Hugh Hefner. Absolute control, exercised from bed, wearing silk pajamas, never leaving, never accommodating anyone else's preferences, never admitting that paradise built by one person for one purpose wasn't paradise at all. It was something else entirely. A kingdom, a fortress, a cage where the architect held all the keys. The silk felt sensual against his skin. The control panels responded to his fingertips. The girlfriends came when summoned. The world operated according to his schedule. And if anyone questioned whether this was freedom, well, they could leave any time. The gates were right there. They just rarely understood, until too late, that leaving meant abandoning everything, and staying meant surrendering yourself one small compromise at a time until you couldn't remember what freedom had felt like before you walked through those gates seeking opportunity and found something else entirely waiting on the other side. By the time Hugh Hefner reached his later years, the Playboy Mansion no longer functioned as a party house in any conventional sense. It functioned as a command center. Hefner rarely left his bedroom, yet nothing inside the mansion happened without his awareness. Power did not require proximity. It required structure. His bedroom sat at the top of the house like a throne room disguised as a private retreat. Silk pajamas became his uniform, not out of eccentricity, but consistency. He did not adapt to the world. The world adapted to him. From that bed, he conducted meetings, received guests, approved appearances, enforced rules, and dispensed money. The physical stillness concealed total operational control. Former residents consistently described the same system, even when they never met each other. There was no written handbook, no formal contract outlining expectations. The rules were learned quickly through consequence. You learned by watching who was favored and who was frozen out. You learned by noticing how silence functioned as correction. Women living in the mansion were not free agents. They were expected to conform visually and behaviorally to Hefner's preferences. Hair was expected to be blonde or lightened. Clothing. Choices followed a narrow aesthetic, youthful and coordinated. Individuality was permitted only within boundaries that did not disrupt the visual identity of the group. You were not there to express yourself. You were there to fit the image. Men were not allowed as visitors. Outside friendships were discouraged, sometimes subtly, sometimes explicitly. Leaving the property required explanation. Returning late was noticed. Security logs recorded movements. Cameras covered the grounds. This was presented as protection, not surveillance. Safety, not control. But the effect was the same. You lived under observation. Money was the most effective tool. Weekly allowances were distributed in cash, directly from Hefner, requiring personal interaction. This ritual reinforced hierarchy. Financial dependence was built into daily life. The amount was enough to maintain appearance, but not enough to build independence. Travel could result in withheld allowances. Missed obligations could lead to punishment that was never announced but always felt. There was always the suggestion that life inside the mansion was optional. Anyone could leave. That was technically true. But leaving meant losing housing, income, social access, career momentum, and the network that had replaced your previous life. The longer someone stayed, the higher the cost of departure became. Choice existed, but it narrowed with time. Mandatory social rituals reinforced this dependency. Evenings with Hefner were expected. Attendance signaled loyalty. Absence raised questions. These gatherings were framed as casual, intimate, even affectionate. In practice, they were checkpoints. Participation mattered. Enthusiasm mattered more. Compliance was rewarded. Hesitation was remembered. Isolation did the rest. Without regular contact with friends outside the mansion, without independent schedules, without private space free from observation, perception slowly shifted. Normal boundaries blurred. Behavior that would have seemed unacceptable elsewhere became routine. Control did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly. What made the system especially effective was that it was never framed as force. It was framed as privilege. Living at the mansion was described as access, opportunity, luck. Gratitude was expected. Questioning the arrangement risked appearing ungrateful or disloyal. Control worked best when resistance could be reframed as personal failure. The mansion itself reinforced this structure. Despite its size, movement within it was limited. There was one primary entrance. Security controlled access. The layout guided people toward shared spaces and away from privacy. Bedrooms assigned to residents were modest and unchanged for decades, even as public areas were carefully maintained for cameras and guests. The message was implicit. The spectacle mattered. The individuals did not. Former residents later described the psychological toll with striking similarity. Anxiety, depression, loss of identity. A sense that time passed without progress. The world outside the gates continued moving, while life inside remained frozen, structured entirely around one man's routine. Days revolved around his schedule. Weeks followed his calendar. Even emotions adjusted to his moods. The brand, meanwhile, sold the opposite image. Playboy presented itself as rebellion against repression, as liberation from outdated morality. The mansion was marketed as the physical embodiment of that freedom. What existed inside contradicted the message. Freedom was centralized, autonomy was conditional, independence was discouraged. The contradiction was not accidental, it was structural. The fantasy required control to function. Images had to be managed. Appearances had to be consistent. Relationships had to remain contained. The mansion was not chaotic indulgence. It was regulated performance. You could leave, people were told. But where would you go after years without savings, without recent work, history, without independent contacts? The system did not lock the gates. It made the outside feel unreachable. That is how the fortress held. Not through force, but through design. Not through violence, but through dependency. It was a place where everything appeared voluntary, yet nothing was truly free. A kingdom that did not need walls because the boundaries existed in the mind. By the time cracks began to show publicly, the structure had already done its work. Those inside had learned the rules well enough to enforce them on themselves. And the man at the center, rarely leaving his bed, remained in control of an empire built not on chaos, but on precision. The mansion was never just a home. It was a system. From the outside, the Playboy Mansion appeared most alive at night. This was when the mythology reached full brightness. Floodlights washed the grounds in soft gold. Music drifted across hedges tall enough to hide the house from the street. Limousines queued at the gates while security checked names against lists that carried more cultural power than most resumes. If Chapter 7 revealed the machinery of control, the parties were its camouflage. The events were real. That matters. The celebrities arrived. The champagne flowed. The photographs were not staged fabrications. Actors, musicians, athletes, executives, politicians, they all passed through the gates. The mansion was not pretending to be important. It was important. That was what made the illusion so effective. The most famous gatherings became cultural landmarks. The Midsummer Night's Dream Party stood above the rest, held annually and styled as a surreal fantasy. Guests wore silk pajamas, lingerie, robes, outfits that suggested intimacy without intimacy ever being offered. The dress code was a masterstroke. It created the feeling of rule-breaking while enforcing uniformity. Everyone looked relaxed, playful, free. Everyone was also performing. Halloween parties followed the same logic. Elaborate costumes, professional performers, decor that transformed the Gothic mansion into a theatrical set. The grounds became a spectacle designed for cameras and memory. These were not spontaneous celebrations. They were curated events built to reinforce the brand. Each party functioned as proof that the Playboy fantasy existed in physical form. The mansion needed witnesses. The guests were not just attendees, they were validators. Their presence confirmed legitimacy. If famous people wanted to be there, then the place had to represent freedom, excess, aspiration. That assumption did most of the work. Few questioned what life looked like when the lights turned off and the guests went home. For the women who lived there, the parties were not liberation. They were obligation. Former residents have described preparing for these events with precision and anxiety. Outfits approved, appearance monitored, smiles required. The role was clear. Be visible, be pleasant, be effortless. You were part of the environment, not the audience. During parties, residents often moved through their own home like extras on a set. They greeted guests, posed for photographs, made sure the fantasy stayed intact. What they did not do was relax. This was not leisure. This was labor, unpaid and unacknowledged, disguised as privilege. The contrast between image and reality grew sharper the longer one looked. The grotto, perhaps the most photographed feature of the mansion, symbolized this contradiction perfectly. In images, it appeared as a hidden paradise, steam rising from warm water, stone walls glowing under soft light. Former residents later reported that the water quality was poor, and that contamination made it unsafe. Years later, when the property changed hands, the grotto would be filled in completely, not preserved, not restored, but sealed. The symbol of pleasure had become a liability. The zoo told a similar story. Exotic animals roamed or remained caged across the grounds. Flamingos, peacocks, monkeys, birds that added spectacle and noise. They looked like decoration. They were living creatures confined for effect. Residents would later note the irony. The animals were visible cages. The people were not. What guests experienced as excess was, for residents, repetition. Parties blurred together. The same faces, the same conversations, the same expectations. There was no sense of progress. Each event reset the cycle. Perform happiness. Maintain the illusion. Return to routine. Security ensured this separation. Guests entered freely but temporarily. Residents remained. Access points were controlled. Movement was observed. When the night ended, the crowd left, and the house returned to its true function. The prison did not need bars because its inmates were still inside when the gates closed. The mythology required silence. Guests rarely stayed long enough to notice patterns. Even if they did, the environment discouraged scrutiny. No one wants to question paradise. No one wants to admit that something so desirable might be hollow. The parties insulated the mansion from criticism by overwhelming it with spectacle. Media coverage reinforced this. Magazines and television segments focused on glamour, laughter, freedom. The camera never lingered on the rules that governed daily life. The absence of visible suffering was mistaken for the absence of harm. This was a place where unhappiness learned to hide. Residents have described watching guests arrive with awe, then leave unchanged, while they themselves remained stuck. Time inside the mansion did not accumulate into independence. It dissolved. Years passed without building a future outside the gates. The parties marked seasons, not progress. The structure depended on this imbalance. Guests consumed the fantasy and departed enriched by proximity. Residents sustained the fantasy and remained depleted. One group gained stories, the other lost years. The phrase adult Disneyland was often used, jokingly, by those inside. In retrospect, the metaphor cuts deeper. Theme parks are designed environments. Everything is controlled. Paths are planned. Joy is choreographed. Visitors experience freedom within strict boundaries. Employees perform happiness as part of the attraction. When the day ends, visitors go home. The workers stay behind. At the mansion, the visitors left. The performers did not. The prison metaphor holds because escape was theoretical, not practical. Leaving meant forfeiting identity that had been shaped entirely around the place. Outside the gates, the world no longer knew who you were. Inside, at least, your role was defined. The parties made that trade look worthwhile. They were bright enough to blind, loud enough to drown out doubt. As long as the music played, the questions stayed quiet. But the cages were always there. Some were visible, like animal enclosures. Others were psychological, financial, social. The bars were invisible because they were internalized. Paradise worked best when it looked undeniable. And that is why the parties mattered more than anything else. They were not celebration. They were reinforcement. Proof that the dream was real enough to protect the prison it concealed. For decades, the Playboy Mansion existed inside a protective fog. Stories circulated, rumors surfaced, but nothing stuck. The brand was too powerful, the imagery too polished, the fantasy too deeply embedded in popular culture. What finally broke the spell was not a single revelation, but accumulation. The truth did not arrive loudly. It arrived steadily. The first cracks appeared when former residents began to speak publicly, not as anonymous sources, but as named individuals willing to attach their identities to their experiences. These accounts did not emerge all at once. They surfaced gradually across books, interviews, and later documentaries, each reinforcing the same pattern rather than contradicting it. In the year 2015, Holly Madison published Down the Rabbit Hole. By that point, she was no longer a peripheral figure. She had been the main girlfriend for years and the most visible resident during the height of the reality television era. Her account was not sensational in tone. It was methodical. She described depression, isolation, and emotional dependency. She described how rules were rarely spoken, yet always enforced. How financial control functioned as leverage. How leaving felt impossible even when staying became unbearable. What gave her testimony weight was specificity. She described curfews, allowances, appearance standards, the pressure to conform. She acknowledged her own complicity without minimizing the system that shaped it. She did not claim physical imprisonment. She described psychological containment. The distinction mattered. Nearly a decade earlier, in the year 2006, Isabella St. James had published Bunny Tales. Her experience predated Madison's time at the mansion, yet the similarities were unmistakable. She described the weekly allowance ritual, the discomfort of asking for money, the way approval and punishment blurred together. She described how participation in mansion life was framed as optional, while consequences for refusal were quietly enforced. Other former residents added corroboration over time. Their accounts varied in detail, but aligned in structure. Isolation from outside relationships. Financial dependency that discouraged independence. Surveillance disguised as security. The expectation of gratitude. The slow erosion of personal identity. What mattered most was consistency. These women did not coordinate their stories. Many had not remained in contact. Some did not even like each other. Yet the same mechanisms appeared repeatedly. Control did not rely on violence. It relied on architecture, routine, reward, and fear of loss. Hugh Hefner publicly dismissed these accounts. He framed them as bitterness from former partners who regretted their choices. This response followed a familiar pattern. By positioning criticism as personal grievance, the system avoided addressing structure. The focus shifted from environment to individual. But the testimony continued. Interviews expanded. Journalists began revisiting earlier assumptions. The reality television portrayal of mansion life, once accepted at face value, was re-examined. Scenes that had looked playful began to appear staged. Moments that seemed spontaneous were understood as edited. Cultural context shifted as well. Conversations about power, consent, and coercion grew more precise. Audiences became better equipped to recognize systems that operate without overt force. What once looked like freedom began to resemble control. Importantly, the narrative did not hinge on a single accusation. There was no singular event that redefined the mansion. There was a pattern. That pattern became impossible to ignore. The phrase "adult Disneyland" resurfaced. No longer as a joke, but as an indictment. A place designed for fantasy. A place where appearance mattered more than well-being. A place where performers sustained joy for others while remaining trapped inside routines they did not control. The idea that the women could leave at any time continued to be used as defense. Former residents addressed this directly. Leaving meant losing housing, income, visibility, and social connection simultaneously. Many had moved to Los Angeles specifically for the mansion. Some had paused education or work. Others had become publicly associated with the Playboy brand to the point that separation felt like erasure. Choice existed, but it existed inside narrowing corridors. What also emerged was the cost after leaving. Former residents described difficulty rebuilding identity. Careers stalled. Trust fractured. Mental health suffered. Freedom did not arrive instantly. It arrived slowly, unevenly, often with guilt attached. The mansion had shaped perception. For years, it had defined success, beauty, and worth. Undoing that conditioning took time. Public reaction shifted gradually. Some resisted. Nostalgia lingered. The Playboy brand still carried cultural weight, but denial weakened as more accounts surfaced. The stories were too aligned, too detailed, too human to dismiss entirely. By the time documentaries revisited the mansion in the late 2000 teens, the narrative had changed. The focus was no longer glamour. It was structure, power, the difference between consent and conditioning. The truth did not erase the past. The parties had happened. The fame had been real. The fantasy had existed. But the cost became visible. The mansion had not been a contradiction to the brand. It had been its most honest expression. A place where freedom was promised, but centrally controlled. Where access replaced autonomy. Where liberation applied selectively. The women who spoke did not claim to represent everyone. Some residents remembered the mansion fondly. Others acknowledged mixed experiences. That complexity mattered. It underscored the point. Control does not require universal suffering to function. It requires silence. That silence broke. And once it did, the image could never fully recover. The Playboy Mansion stopped being a symbol of aspiration and became a case study, not of excess, but of how power disguises itself as pleasure. The truth did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with testimony. And testimony, once heard, cannot be unseen. Hugh Hefner died in the year 2017 at the age of 91, in the same bedroom where he had spent the final decades of his life. The room had changed little since the 1970s. The man who built a global brand around youth, pleasure, and rebellion passed away surrounded not by spectacle, but by stillness. The empire he controlled from bed outlived him, but the physical symbol of that empire was already collapsing. The Playboy Mansion had been sold the year before his death. In the year 2016, billionaire investor Darren Metropolis purchased the Holmby Hills property for $100 million, with a legal agreement allowing Hefner to live there for the remainder of his life. The sale itself marked the beginning of the end. Ownership changed hands. The illusion lost its anchor. Once Hefner died, the mansion was no longer protected by mythology. It became real estate. And when contractors, engineers, and inspectors began to examine the structure closely, the fantasy gave way to facts. Decades of neglect had taken their toll. The mansion, outwardly iconic, was internally compromised. Reports confirmed extensive structural deterioration, outdated systems, and environmental hazards. The property was not simply old, it was unsafe. The famous grotto, once marketed as a centerpiece of pleasure and excess, was discovered to be contaminated beyond practical repair. Rather than restore it, the decision was made to fill it in completely. The symbol that had defined the mansion for generations was sealed and erased. This mattered more than it seemed. The grotto had not been removed for aesthetic reasons. It had been removed because it posed a risk. What had once been framed as indulgence was now officially classified as a problem. Renovation plans revealed the scale of decay. Wiring, plumbing, foundations, everything required replacement. The mansion could not be preserved as it was. It had to be stripped down to its frame. The house that sold the world a fantasy of effortless luxury had been rotting quietly beneath the surface. As the physical structure was dismantled, so was its cultural power. Without Hefner, without the parties, without the controlled access, the mansion stopped being a symbol. It became a case study. The Playboy brand continued, But the house that had anchored its mythology no longer existed in any meaningful way. Renovation did not mean restoration, it meant erasure. Every trace of the Playboy era was removed, animal enclosures disappeared, party spaces were demolished, private rooms were gutted, the fortress was taken apart piece by piece. There was no grand reckoning, no courtroom verdict, no official apology. Empires like this do not collapse with spectacle. They dissolve when their utility ends. Former residents watched this transformation from a distance. For some, it felt like closure. For others, it reopened wounds. The place that had shaped years of their lives was being erased, but the impact remained. A demolished building does not undo lived experience. The mansion's fate exposed the final contradiction. The brand promised permanence, legacy, freedom without consequence. The reality was temporary, fragile, and dependent on constant control. Once that control vanished, nothing held. What replaced the mansion was not another fantasy. It was a private residence, redesigned to meet modern standards of safety and habitability. No zoo, no grotto, no spectacle. The very elements that made the mansion famous were the ones that could not survive scrutiny. The bunny logo still exists. The merchandise still sells. The image still circulates. But the physical kingdom that gave the fantasy credibility is gone. That absence is the real ending. The Playboy Mansion was never destroyed by scandal alone. It was destroyed by exposure, aging, and the simple fact that illusions cannot outlast reality forever. The house did not fall dramatically. It failed structurally. The fantasy required constant performance. The building required maintenance. Neither could sustain itself indefinitely. In the end, the mansion delivered exactly what it was built to deliver. A controlled environment where one man's version of freedom ruled. When that control ended, the structure had nothing left to support it. The brand sold liberation. The house revealed the cost. And when the gates finally closed for good, what remained was not paradise lost, but a truth uncovered. The kingdom was never meant to last. If this story unsettled you, it should. Because the Playboy Mansion wasn't an exception, it was a template. Power wrapped in fantasy. Control sold as choice. And this house was only one address where the illusion cracked. Like this video if you believe stories hidden behind glamour deserve daylight. Subscribe, because what happened here didn't end when the gates closed. In the next investigation, we follow the same pattern into a place that still looks untouched, still celebrated, still protected, where no renovations have begun and no voices were supposed to survive. The walls are standing. The silence is not.